Okay, so let's dive straight into it. Interestingly, yesterday we had our board meeting, and this whole topic around the impact of regulation on our industry came up, and there was a frank discussion around the level of regulatory rules that we're seeing throughout the globe, and this emerging trend, we're seeing it in Ireland with new regulation around having to register SMS sender IDs. We've seen it in Singapore, we're seeing it in Malaysia, and we're also seeing it in India. And there's this good debate to have around, and I think it was brought up by John on the previous panel, around the level of self-regulation that the industry could promote versus the amount of regulation and rules we have no control over that's being imposed on us by regulators. So I thought maybe I'd start with you, Anurag, and we could talk a bit about the India experience. And I know that Trey has been putting in place a lot of strict regulations.
Yeah, so I think we discussed in length yesterday in our board meeting where we spoke about how as an industry, we need to get together to try and bring about as much of self-regulation as possible as opposed to externally imposed regulation by the telecom regulators. And what's happened in India actually is quite the opposite. In India, we have the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India, TRAI, which has been quite active in bringing about a lot of regulations. But I think to an extent it's been for the good. In India, we actually had these regulations starting in 2014. And at the moment, we are one of the few countries in the world which actually has a blockchain-based technology. And that, let me actually, sorry, I had my back towards that side of the audience. We actually have a blockchain-based technology wherein every message, every SMS that passes through domestically in India has to go through an entire distributed ledger technology before it actually goes through to the end user. To that extent, I think regulation has been good because that has helped bring about a lot more transparency. It has helped in curbing some level of spam, and we are seeing a good effect of these regulations. But if you ask me that, given all the players sitting out here, we are the ones who are most impacted by whatever regulations come in. Today, we are also seeing that there is a very thin line between the telco-based channels and the OTT-based channels. And we are seeing different markets have different regulations around it. I'll take a recent experience. So in GMS, we are active in Pakistan as one of the countries, for example. And in Pakistan, there are actually rules around voice and messaging. And there's a very silent steering clear from the topic of regulations on WhatsApp, for example. And there's nothing very clear on that. So I think as an industry, what's very important is especially what we are discussing today about the advent of RCS, the increasing prominence of, Renesha spoke about WhatsApp business messaging. I think it's very important that we as an industry actually come forward. And I feel MEA, for example, is one of the best forums. We were discussing that at length yesterday, that how we can make sure that the members can actually pool and contribute resources and make sure that we can help guide the regulators rather than being guided by the regulators. And I think that's a very important call to action for all of us. If we can find ways that these OTT channels, which very soon are going to come under the purview of the telecom regulators, how we can try and make sure that before that happens, we can actually bring about a certain level of regulation on our own. I mentioned earlier to Tim Atkinson as well in the RCS session that ever since RCS has started, there's so much of spam, unsolicited spam that's coming through. Mm-hmm. So if we can get together, we have the right ecosystem in place, I think there's a lot that can be done within self-regulation amongst us.
Thanks, Anurag. Maybe, Molly, we'll go to you next and just get the perspective from Juniper Research on what you're seeing in the landscape currently.
Yeah, there's a couple of points I wanted to mention here. So the first being this kind of trend towards whitelisting of players in the SMS value chain. So rather than blacklisting, where previously the company, the wholesale aggregator would have had to have committed fraud and then they're blacklisted. We're now going to see kind of whitelisting of these aggregators instead. So this has kind of been driven by the rise of AIT, which has been a significant problem, obviously, for SMS as a channel. And so hopefully with this kind of whitelisting process, This will help to reduce AIT, and what we're expecting now actually is the number of SMS messages which can be associated with AIT will actually decline over the next 5 years. So we've got 65 billion messages, SMS messages that are associated with AIT in 2024. But by 2029, we're expecting this to decrease. So that's kind of one of the points I wanted to mention. The second point being, obviously, with this massive growth in RCS, as people have probably mentioned previously today, SMS obviously had that large amount of time to evolve and those regulations to develop. But if we're going to see this massive growth in RCS over the next few years, fraudsters will come to the channel to exploit it. And therefore, we'll need this faster evolution of regulation over the channel. Other challenges we might see might include, obviously, this rich media content aspect. How do we go about monitoring content that's rich media as opposed to plain text that we have with SMS? But yeah, we'll still see some of these same issues that we have with SMS, such as the account takeover aspect. And we may still see that spoofing over P2P RCS. So again, that making consumers aware of brand verification will be incredibly important. The next 2 years are going to be very important for ensuring we have that trust in RCS. Otherwise, we may see the traffic go to these OTT channels or maybe APIs, especially for that authentication traffic. And we may see that increased need for regulatory bodies to be involved. Obviously, Google have played a massive role in driving that development of RCS, but over the next couple of years, we'll definitely need that increased involvement for regulatory bodies to ensure that mobile subscribers will be protected.
Thanks, Molly. Just before coming to you, Danny, maybe circle back to one thing you said around, I'm not sure everyone online or everyone here, we don't always use the same terminology. So when you're talking about whitelisting and blacklisting, can you just explain what you mean by that?
So with wholesale aggregators, they can easily set up a business. It doesn't take very much to set up the business. And currently we have a process where instead of making sure that those are trustworthy before they can carry on and do their business, you have blacklisting. So they might have already carried out fraud and then they'll get blacklisted. But with whitelisting, you're ensuring that those wholesale aggregators are actually trustworthy in the first place, so that if they can't go out then commit the fraud. So that should hopefully helps reduce that fraud across the SMS channel.
Excellent. All right, thanks. So coming to you, Danny, maybe switching gears a little bit. Danny, obviously with a legal background, you look at these issues from the legal consequences for the different stakeholders. And I know we have a lot of conversations in our working groups at MEF around, for example, what kind of data can be exchanged amongst different stakeholders in order to help prevent fraud. And we often get mixed signals, not just from people within, sometimes from two people from the same company might have a different perspective, and different regulators might have a different perspective on what is and what isn't allowed. But just generally tell us from your point of view what you're seeing in terms of the regulatory landscape and some of the key concerns.
Yeah, thank you. It's a very good point you make about different companies having different approaches, and that was certainly those which have got operations in multiple countries. I mean, I was speaking at a conference on AI 2 weeks ago in Paris, and my local French lawyer was just helping one of the companies who got dawn raid by the local data privacy authority in France, the CNIL. They are very, very proactive, and anyone who's had the misfortune of having to deal with them will know how tough they are. But that will shape, Orange's approach to all of this. So you have to understand where the MNO's coming from and what they're up against in their home market, and that will mean potentially a different approach across different jurisdictions. But in broad terms, I think we've got the GDPR now. Most of us should have guidelines in terms of how to deal with the issues. And then but the GDPR, that is being implemented by the data privacy regulators. And they are, in a way, more of a menace because of the fines. They don't understand the telecoms market the same way as the telecoms regulators. So we do, as an industry, need to engage with them more. At a MEF panel last year. I had a guest from Ofcom. I asked him who at Ofcom is responsible for interacting with the UK data privacy regulator, the ICO, and he said no one. And that is a problem for the industry if we're not getting our message across to the data privacy regulators. And what Anurag was saying is very much music to my ears. I've been mentioning it over many years through MEF that we do need to shape guidelines. And a lot of it is, if we can have industry guidance, having your paperwork in place. If there is an issue, you've got to show that you've taken appropriate measures to mitigate your risk and the industry's risk. And if you say we've followed the MEF guidelines, or industry guidelines, that's X. We've got our own policies in place. This is how we handle data. We've got GDPR. We've got the consent potentially, or lawful basis for processing data. It doesn't have to be consent. There can be legitimate interest, contractual requirements. But you do, unfortunately, need to have the policies. Now, with RCS, and as it becomes more sophisticated, and with the advent of AI, it's going to be more invasive. I mean, from brand's perspective, it's going to be much more positive in terms of the action, but those people who are going to complain, who don't want to get those messages, are going to see it as much more invasive. So you're going to have more, I think you've got to be prepared for more complaints, ultimately, from the RCS. And then when they look at what the industry is doing, that's when we have to really make sure we've got our ducks in a row from a compliance and operational guidelines perspective. And the other element is, with AI in the European Union, we have the AI Act coming into force next year. So unfortunately, you have a whole new series of guidelines to really deal with and make sure you've got all your policies in place to be compliant with the AI Act. And AI will also, I would say, increase, so I'm talking too much, potential of fraud. Ultimately, the AI is helping the fraudsters as well. So even more reason to make sure you've got all your policies compliant. So you've got a really clean slate of guidelines you can show that you've followed if you do get approached. The other element, I would expect that the MNOs will probably have increasing guidelines, because ultimately they could be potentially exposed. And one thing to note is, if the MNOs get fined because one of the ATP or carriers or other people in the chain have done, they'll be looking under their indemnities. If they're fined 4% of their turnover, that's a hell of a lot more. And the contractual element is probably potentially more likely to bite than a regulator knocking at the door. So you've just got to think about that chain, and everyone in that chain, it's in all your interest, is compliant. And the contractual aspects will also be important to negotiate back on those indemnities, and also liability for fraud. So I think AI is going to increase potential for fraud in the industry. And whenever there's a fraud element I've got to deal with, you do look at the contractual wording in those contracts. So please think about those very carefully. Sorry, that's too much. But there's a lot to cover. Yeah. And I know Caroline was asked a question by Ellie last time, but plenty more. I'm happy to talk about.
That's great. We've touched on a lot of topics that we're addressing at MEF and the various working groups. And I see people here today that are in these working groups. I want to dig into, kind of circle back again and dig into a couple. One is around this thinking that there's a lot of different sets of rules in different markets, and it's very hard to navigate for a global stakeholder. So whether you're a brand or a CPaaS provider or even an operator, having to deal with different sets of rules in different markets is a challenge. So part of my question is around that. The other part of the question is around we're sort of using SMS and RCS interchangeably in what we're saying right now. Most of the regulation we've seen to date is obviously addressing SMS because that's where the market is, but we see the market moving to RCS. And what do the panelists feel? Can we inform ourselves around whether we expect any changes in the regulatory landscape to address RCS that's different from SMS, which is something kind of similar? maybe I'll start with you, Molly, and then Anurag, you can kind of address the same question.
Yeah, sure. So obviously SMS, as you say, is well established. It's had that time to develop those regulations. But from what we forecast in our data, we think there's going to be more than 2.5 billion RCS users by the end of 2026, and that is active users, not RCS-capable users. So yeah, we've obviously got that brand verification aspect, which has obviously been talked about quite a lot. Again, that's those rich media content capabilities that might present new challenges. I don't know, obviously Danny might have more to say on how we go about maybe regulating and monitoring the content that now goes into rich media messages as opposed to SMS. And also, again, you have those increased conversational capabilities, which you don't have with SMS. So with those increased conversational capabilities, we might have more chatbots being deployed over RCS, for example. And again, that's going to present some new challenges with how obviously consumers are engaging with brands via RCS and how we then protect their data and privacy with that as well.
Thanks. Over to you, Anurag.
So if you look at it, I think RCS implicitly at least addresses some parts of the loopholes or the gaps which exist in SMS today, right? So the good part is that RCS is the next frontier of SMS. So it's not technically an OTT channel. It's actually considered almost like a telco channel of sorts, right? Especially the way I've always heard Google position it, that they always say that finally it's a telco channel, telco owns it. In fact, somebody jokingly came up to me during lunch and said that when I raised the issue of spam, Google washed it off saying that maybe it's the OPCO to look into it. So maybe they are really saying it's the OPCO who owns the channel, right? So now the point is that we have a telco-owned channel, which is rich in terms of its content, and it's still unregulated, right? So I actually caught on to something that Danny said, which made a lot of sense, that with the advent of AI, the scope of fraud is going to increase tremendously. And now when we look at RCS as a new communication channel, which is beyond the 160 characters text messaging, the actual level of fraud can actually increase far more than what exists today in just, I mean, today text messaging is all about typically sending phishing links, right? You click on that and something happens. But the minute you open that entire channel to a whole new set of capabilities, and to add to that, you have, say, AI backing that, that can actually open up RCS to being much more prone to fraud. So I do see that in the coming days, there will be more regulation around RCS. I don't see that happening in the near future, which is why I was saying I think it's very important that if we as an industry can try and make sure, I mean, classic case, in India, Google tested RCS in 2022 and it became crazy level of spam. They had to literally roll back RCS. I mean, India was, I think, in the rear there, I think India was the only market, I think, where Google had to roll back RCS, I think. Yeah, if I remember correctly. Yeah, exactly. So you know, I mean, that was the level of impact that RCS, when left unleashed and untethered, what impact it had, that embarrassingly it had to be rolled back. And it was now relaunched in a new avatar where there was a proper backing of an operator, Vodafone to start with. So to that extent, for sure, this is a channel which requires regulation. The more we can try and self-regulate, the lesser will be the necessity for a regulator to come in and impose their whims and fancies. But I think it will take some time before RCS even reaches that point of regulators looking at it. I think at the moment, there are markets like Renisha mentioned, right, that they have markets where they have a right to win. So she mentioned India, for example. She mentioned Brazil, LATAM. These are markets where, to start with, WhatsApp has actually taken prevalence. And there was another slide which showed the yellows and the blues, I think it was by Cinch, where RCS is just picking up. So in my view, I think there is still some time for RCS to actually take center stage. But WhatsApp is starting to come on the radars of the right to win countries of Meta, at least, wherein there is active conversation of having some sort of a regulation around it. And Meta for sure, as in WhatsApp for sure, all the three channels that Renisha mentioned, they're all owned by a private operator as compared to the mobile operator at large, right? So I think WhatsApp might still be more prone to regulation at the moment. RCS should be, but I think there's still some time before the before the regulators start taking note of RCS. Yeah.
Thanks, Anurag. Danny, do you want to add anything to that, or?
No, Anurag's completely. I mean, I could just say with RCS, the risk also of a front page news story coming up about the industry, and then you've got the regulators under pressure for the government just rushing through some legislation. I've seen it in other countries where regulators have taken some draconian, nonsensical steps just because of something in the press. We have to be ready for that story to appear, given the nature of RCS, the information that's coming well beyond the 160 characters. And we've got to be prepared as an industry to say we've got the steps, and for regulators to take a very, very sudden knee-jerk reaction.
Right, thanks. I mean, all the more reason for people to join our working groups on looking at that. I have more questions, but I'm looking at the time. We have roughly 5 minutes left. So I'd just like to pause and see if there's any questions in the audience before I move to my next question. No? So Danny, sticking with you, and Meta was on a panel 2 panels ago. And they brought up this question around opt-in. Mm-hmm. And I know there's a lot of confusion, I think, around opt-in and whether operators need express consent from the end user to get their message, right? Can you just expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think I alluded to it very quickly earlier on. Under the GDPR, and that it's sort of the principle that is increasingly being adopted in terms of the consent across an increasing number of jurisdictions. But going back to GDPR for Europe, you have to have a lawful basis of processing personal data. Informed consent is one of those bases, but there are other reasons and justifications. So one can be if you need it for the contract, or legitimate basis if you're doing it for anti-fraud. So opt-in is relatively safe, but it's one way of doing it. But the consent can also be withdrawn at any time. So you've got to have systems. If you are relying on opt-in, you have to make sure you've got systems which allow data subjects, as they're called, to opt out, and then the systems to update that. But if you can actually justify that it's actually a legitimate basis, for the processing, or for example, for anti-fraud, or it's necessary for the performance of the contract, then that actually gives you broader base.
Right, thanks. And we were having that conversation around finding that balance between protecting privacy and having access to data in order to combat fraud. And where does that balance lie? And it comes back to the first question I think I asked, which was, we have different opinions from regulators as well as different government agencies and within the industry itself. And I don't know, maybe I'll give Anurag and Molly the final word on where they see that balance between protecting privacy and having the data we need to be able to combat fraud.
I think that was.
Yeah, sure. It's obviously a very important point. But not only that, obviously, what we're seeing is obviously with the brand verification aspect of RCS as well, is finding that balance between verifying brands, making sure that's a seamless process to get brands onboarded, whilst also ensuring you don't let that leakage of fraudulent companies in as well. So I just thought that might be an extra point that is kind of relevant to that as well.
I would just say that I feel data privacy is a myth. That's my view out of whatever I've experienced of omni-channel communication platforms. I think most platforms, most channels claim about data privacy being existing in some shape and form. But I think beyond a point, it's a sense of comfort which nobody really can see or feel, and it's just something you know about. But it's almost like a placebo effect. It's there, but is it really there? So in my view, I think while I think GDPR is one of the only few regulations right now which has still come around data privacy. But still, what I have experienced in my own personal past 10 years of working on SMS and now the other channels, I personally believe that I don't think data privacy is something that can easily be achieved in spite of whether we are talking about end-to-end encryption or we are talking about on-premise systems being in place. But eventually the data goes out. So if you really ask me, I think there will be more efforts, of course, around bringing more data privacy into play. There will be efforts into bringing more user consent into play. But still, I feel that whatever data is going out there, we've seen now that, for example, we operate in Switzerland. We've seen scenarios where Swiss banks' data is actually floating around, which is not as private as it should be. And these are Swiss banks that you're talking about. So to that extent, I feel that there will be more advent of regulations in data privacy, but still, I don't think it'll anyways get us to the end goal of keeping data private. That's my personal take on it.
Yeah. A lot to think about. Look, we're 5 seconds left. We have a question, so let's just go. We have one question over there.
I was going to say, keep doing that. Right.
Talking about regulatory landscape for RCS and also for WhatsApp, I think you brought up. If you look at SMS, in many, many countries, there is a regime from regulators about the do not disturb. So consumer can say, please do not disturb me, don't send me spams. In some countries, it's simple DND. In some cases, like India, it's very involved DND. With RCS also being a telecom service now in more and more countries, why do you see that the regulators are not involved in also enforcing a DND for RCS? And with WhatsApp being so popular, of course, there is no DND regime on WhatsApp I'm aware of anywhere. I don't know if it'll ever happen or not, but with RCS being a telco service, how do you see that DND regime coming to RCS? In fact, many of the businesses kind of relish the fact that, if we send marketing messages over SMS, we can't send it because 30% of the base is DND. But if you send them over RCS, will go to everybody. Send them over WhatsApp, it will go to everybody.
Right. Okay. From my perspective, I feel that DND again is a sham. In fact, in India, for example, it was the most embarrassing thing which the regulator had to do, because in India, you could actually, till a few years ago, actually download the entire DND database from the regulator's website and actually start spamming people. So that's when they had to actually stop DND altogether in India. And that's when the DLT regime came in and they stopped giving delivery reports for promotional messages. So those are the sort of measures that have to be brought in. So if you ask me, DND as a mechanism of effectively blocking unwanted messages is also not been very effective worldwide. So I think right now regulators are still grappling with how to ensure DND is effective in messaging as an SMS. As I said before, Inder, I do feel that it will come into the ambit of RCS as well eventually. But I think at the moment, regulators are far from even knowing clearly what exactly is happening in the RCS space. So I think, in my understanding right now, whether it's your other OTT channels, privately owned OTT channels, if I put it that way, or it's in terms of SMS, I think that's where still efforts are on to bring in DND. And I think more and more that we are able to fine-tune our opt-in services. And that's what I raised to Tim during break, and he mentioned that we are actually bringing in an opt-in and an opt-out option in RCS. So I think if we are able to do that, that to a large extent will again manage the entire DND fiasco which exists everywhere. That's my view.
Thanks, Anurag. I'm conscious we're over time, but Molly or Danny, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Not given the time. It's flashing.
I know it's
0, 0,
All
yeah.
right, well, thank you, panel, so much. Well, thanks again.
Thank you.